Did you know that the Christmas story everyone knows, with the shepherds and the wise men, is actually an amalgamation of the accounts found in the Gospels of Luke and Matthew? Today, Dr. Bart Ehrman answers my questions about the inconsistencies in these two narratives and whether they can be reconciled. Welcome to Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman, the only show where a 6-time New York Times best-selling author and world-renowned Bible scholar uncovers the many fascinating, little-known facts about the New Testament, the historical Jesus, and the rise of Christianity. I'm your host, Megan Lewis. Let's begin. Hello again. Before we get started, I wanted to make sure you knew about the specials we're running this December on all of our Christmas-themed courses. Highlights include a brand new course with Dr. Jodi Magness, Herod, the Tyrant of Christmas, plus a new face-to-face on the Bible discussion asking, was Jesus really born in Bethlehem? A lively conversation between Bart and Catholic apologist Jimmy Akin. We're also offering up to 60% off our Christmas courses with a limited time Christmas bundle. Head over to barterman.com/courses for all the holiday deals, good for December only. And as always, use the code MJPodcast at checkout for a special discount. Welcome back, everybody, to Misquoting Jesus, where today we are talking about the Christmas story, whether it was a myth, and exactly why Luke and Matthew have such differing accounts. We also have listeners' questions at the end, where I will be asking Bart whether the Last Supper was an historical event, so make sure you stick around for that. But before all of those things, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. As we record this here, I have finished teaching. I had my last classes yesterday at UNC, and I've been thinking, of course, kind of reminiscing about the past. My first classes at UNC, and my first classes ever teaching at a university at Rutgers in 1984, and it's kind of been fun going down memory lane. And I'm going to be especially missing the undergraduate classroom, because there's just no way to replace what you get when you're in a room with 19 and 20-year-olds talking about important things, and you can't get that otherwise. And I'm going to miss that, but I'm looking forward to retirement when I can actually do the other things I'm supposed to be doing too.
We've had several people commenting since you announced your retirement, saying that they hope the podcast isn't going anywhere, and it's definitely not. Are you going to be adding new projects to your lineup, or are you going to just enjoy having time to focus on the ones that you've already got going?
Well, my wife Sarah's convinced I'm going to be adding things. Like there's no way to stop me. but my goal is the problem I've had the last few years is that, we have the podcast, which is, it's fantastic. I'm really enjoying this, and I have the blog that I do 5 times a week to raise money for charity, and we have this company, the Paths in Biblical Studies, that produces online courses and events and things. And I'm really deeply involved with all that, with other things in my life. And I got to a point where I realized, with the growth of all of these things, I'm unable both to teach and to write books. And I've taught for 41 years in universities, and I thought, as much as I really love it, I think I need to give that one up. So, because I still want to do my research and writing, so I'm going to keep up everything else. So people have asked me, "Are you going to stop the blog?" No, not at all. I'm not going to stop any of these other things, but I'm hoping not to add too many other things, so that I can do my research and writing.
So it sounds like you previously had 3 full-time jobs, and now you're reducing that to just 2 of them.
Yeah, that's Sarah has long said that I had 3 full-time jobs, and it's kind of true. And but I wanted to put more time into that, and more time for things that I enjoy doing that I just don't have time to do. They have nothing to do with scholarship, like hiking through the woods more often, that kind of thing. And so so that's the goal, and I'm really looking forward to it. So my final grades are due next week, and after that I'm seeing it as a clean break. So,
well, congratulations.
Thanks.
And talking about having more time for things like writing books and the rest of your projects, I have a book related question to kind of get us going. Have you ever started to write a book, completely hit a wall, and then had to start over again?
Oh God, no. No, and the reason is because of the way I write. Now, I've for all these years, I've had PhD students, and I've always tried to convince each one of them how to write a book, and none of them does what I tell them to do. Like it's never happened, but because they think, that's, I don't know, man, but it works for me, which is that I think I mentioned before, I do all my research, like even for a popular trade book, it takes me about 2 years of reading, taking notes, thinking about things, and then I make outlines for what I imagine that I have a thesis I'm going to be arguing. Then the main points will be the main chapters, and the subpoints or subheadings within the chapters, and I do outlines. I outline the whole thing. My outlines sometimes are ridiculous. I mean, they're like, I might have a 20-page outline for a chapter that has to be 20 pages. So how's that going to work? But what it means is that when I start writing, the actual writing itself goes very fast, especially for these trade books, because I already know exactly what I want to say in the sequence I want to say it. And so it's just a matter of putting prose into readable prose. And so, I write these, the writing themselves very fast. I mean, I can write, most of these trade books take me 2 weeks to write. But it's because I spent 2 years doing
You
the
spent
research.
2 years putting everything in except like the adjectives and the conjunctions.
Yeah, that's it. And you just make good prose out of it as much as you can, and so I've never, ever like hit the wall the way everybody else seems to. But I say, man, the way not to do that is I'm telling you how to do it. And yeah, I'm not going to do it that way.
It sounds like too much hard work up front.
It's work,
I'll
right?
just space my hard work.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So today we're talking about the Christmas story, and I believe the episode is going to be titled, Was the Christmas Story a Myth, or Is the Christmas Story a Myth? So what do Bible scholars mean when they talk about a myth? And is that the same as when non-scholars talk about them?
Well, it's the term myth is a very tricky term, and even scholars debate about the best way to define it. And so whatever I say here, people will disagree with, but it's okay. I'll tell you the way I do it is when I think of myth, I think of some kind of narrative that somehow involves divine beings, that is something that didn't actually happen, but that is trying to convey some kind of truth, some kind of truth. It's trying to convey meaning. And one way to look at this is to differentiate it from legend. In my mind, legend refers to historical figures, and everything about the story is natural. There's nothing supernatural about a legend. It's about an individual. So it could be, legends about Abraham Lincoln, for example, or about Julius Caesar, but they're actual people, but they don't involve the supernatural, but they're fictional, or aspects of the fictional. Myths also are fictional in the sense that they're things that didn't happen, but they usually involve, I think they have to involve some kind of supernatural force, some kind of divine being. Um, I think a lot of people use the term myth, in my experience, to mean something that's not true. Oh, it's just a myth. Um, and I don't use it that way, um, because myths actually are meant to be true. It's just that they're not historical. And there's a difference between something being historical and something conveying a truth. And so it used to really confuse my kids when they were little, because we'd be watching a movie and, at some point, they're young teenagers, they say, is this a true story? And I'd say, yes, it is. And they'd say, well, oh, wait a second. Did it happen? I say, no, it didn't happen.
Mine have learned to ask, Mummy, did this really happen?
Yeah.
That's a different question.
It's a different question, and it's weird, in the modern world, that's what we're concerned about. What really happened, as if like history is like the only thing that counts for some people. But of course, there's lots of truth that has nothing to do with history. I mean, I just finished reading David Copperfield for the umpteenth time, my favorite novel of all time. It didn't happen, but for me, it's deeply meaningful and conveys truth that I like to incorporate in my life. So a myth is like that. It's didn't happen. It involves the supernatural, but it's trying to convey a truth.
Thank you. So which Gospels then do we find the story of the Nativity in?
Well, this is the interesting thing. People, when I was an evangelical Christian, we insisted that you have to believe literally in the story of Jesus' birth. He's born of a virgin. If you don't believe this, you can't be a Christian. And it turns out that in the New Testament, there are 27 books, and there are only two of the books that even mention the virgin birth, and that's Matthew and Luke. So in Mark's gospel, the gospel begins with Jesus as an adult being baptized by John the Baptist. The Gospel of John begins in eternity past. In the beginning was the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we're told that this Word became flesh and dwelt among us, but there's no account of his birth. And so neither Mark nor John has anything about a virgin birth in Bethlehem to Mary, anything like that. And Paul doesn't say anything about it. None of the other books says anything about it.
So, as I said in my introduction, Matthew and Luke's accounts of the birth are often kind of rolled into one for things like church nativity plays,
Yeah.
but they're actually very distinct and different stories. Could you go over briefly which details that people will be familiar with are found in which account?
This is an exercise I give my students, my undergraduate students, because it's an easy one to do, and everybody should do it because it's eye-opening. I have them read Matthew's gospel, the account of birth. It's in Matthew chapters 1 and 2, and I simply tell them, list everything that happens in the sequence that happened. Boom, 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 boom. And then I say, okay, now, and then do the same thing for Luke and list everything that happens. Boom, 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 boom. And compare the list and see what's similar and what's different. And are there any differences that cannot be reconciled? And it's a really interesting exercise. But so, in Matthew, Matthew has the account of Jesus being born in Bethlehem. The wise men, the magi, we're not told how many there are, but they come and they worship him in his house in Bethlehem. And King Herod of the Jews finds out that the king of the Jews has been born, and he doesn't like the competition, so he sends out the troops to kill all the young boys in Bethlehem. But Joseph learns in a dream it's going to happen, and so he takes the family down to Egypt. And then they, once Herod dies, then they return, but they can't return to Bethlehem because now Archelaus is the ruler, and he's worse than his father Herod was, and so they relocate to Nazareth. So that's that's the story in Matthew. And the story of Luke doesn't have most of that. It doesn't have Jesus being born, and it doesn't have them living in a house in Bethlehem. It doesn't have them flying down to Egypt. Doesn't have Herod killing the innocents. Doesn't have the wise men coming. Luke has the account of where Joseph and Mary live in Nazareth, and there's a census in the world where the entire world has to be enrolled for the census. And because Joseph is from the lineage of King David, he has to go to the birthplace of his ancestor David, and he goes to Bethlehem. And while there, Mary goes into labor, and she has a child there. And then, 8 days later, they have Jesus circumcised, and then 32 days later, Mary performs a sacrifice for her ritual impurity for having given birth, and then they return to Nazareth. And so Luke has the shepherds, for example, and Matthew has the wise men. Luke has the census where they have to go down to Bethlehem. Matthew has their flight to Egypt, and so there are these differences. And the reality is that the Christmas stories that people see in a Christmas pageant are a combination of these two stories, where they put them all the details together into one.
Now we're going to get into the differences and whether these two stories can be reconciled in a couple of minutes. But I wanted to just ask very quickly, what other birth narratives do we have? And again, how different are they to what people are familiar with?
The birth narratives of Jesus, you mean? Yeah. Okay. Well, early Christians had lots of ways of explaining how Jesus came into the world. And, one early church father who was very influential, named Marcion, who ended up being declared a heretic, said that Jesus wasn't born at all. He descended from heaven in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar as a full-grown adult. And so he just came down from heaven. So we do have other birth narratives, though. All the other ones that we have are based on Matthew and Luke, and kind of riffing on the themes of Matthew and or Luke. The most famous is the proto-gospel of James. which is from the early 2nd century, which has other kinds of details about it, more miraculous events happening, and including a midwife who comes to examine Mary internally in order to see whether she's still a virgin, even though the child has been born. She's checking to see whether her hymen is still intact. And it is. And it's a strange story. And so you do get these later accounts, but they're all kind of riffing on what you have in Matthew and Luke.
Thank you. We will return to Matthew and Luke in a moment, but we do have a special announcement before we go much further. On Sunday, December the 21st, we're hosting our second ever face-to-face on the Bible discussion. Bart, could you just remind people, for those who don't know, haven't caught it, what the goal is for these face-to-face on the Bible discussions?
Some years ago, I was at a professional conference and I was having dinner with my literary agent, and we're talking about like the Gospel of Mark or something. We're going back and forth, and he's interested in this. I'm talking about, and after a half an hour, he said, there are people who would pay money to hear this conversation. I said, really? And so that's what these face-to-face things are. You have two scholars talking about some issue of interest to both of them and to the wider public, and where they're just talking about it. Just like you're having a conversation at a conference. What would scholars talk about if they're talking about this kind of thing? And so that's what they are, and people can listen in. And so it's a really fun idea, I think.
And they're informal and they're non-confrontational and very enjoyable. And this time on the 21st, we have Dr. Bart Ehrman, which you may be familiar with, and Catholic apologist Jimmy Akin discussing whether Jesus was really born in Bethlehem. And then there will be archaeologist Jonathan Adler and the world-renowned Bible scholar Laura Nasrallah discussing the world Jesus entered into. If you've ever wondered about what the word looks like religiously, or what the world looks like religiously, culturally, and politically at the time of Jesus' birth, then this is definitely a discussion for you. And don't forget, also, Jodi Magness will be recording her course on Herod, the Tyrant of Christmas, this Saturday on December 13th. So this is your last chance to sign up for that if you would like to see the live recording and have a chance to participate in the Q&A. If you want more information about the face-to-face on Christmas discussions or Herod, the Tyrant of Christmas, you can visit bartehrman.com, and as always, use the code MJPodcast at checkout for a special discount. Now, special announcements over. We are going to get back to Matthew and Luke. And as you were mentioning earlier, Bart, there are some quite substantial differences between the two accounts. One has shepherds, one has magi, one has a census, one has a flight to Egypt. So I'd like to just take a few minutes and go over some of them. Luke has Mary and Joseph travel to Bethlehem from Nazareth to take part in this census, while Matthew has the family living in Bethlehem already when Jesus was born. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on there?
Yeah, it's really one of the key issues because, Matthew has them in a house in Bethlehem. It's pretty clear Bethlehem is their hometown, especially because when they flee to Egypt for a long time, months, years, I don't know, until Herod dies, and when they come back, they want to go back to Judea where Bethlehem is, but they can't because of Archelaus, so they have to resettle in Nazareth. And so in this account, the hometown is Bethlehem, but Jesus ends up growing up in Nazareth. In Luke's account, it's the opposite. The hometown is Nazareth, and they're just visiting. They're visiting Bethlehem for a while, and then when the child's born, 40 days later, they go back to Nazareth. What both accounts are trying to do is trying to explain how it is Jesus of Nazareth, who is known to come from Nazareth, how it is he was actually born somewhere else. And Matthew indicates pretty clearly why these authors would want to do that. Matthew quotes Micah chapter 5, verse 2, a prophet of the Hebrew Bible, which says that out of Bethlehem will come the Savior, the one who will lead the people. And so Matthew takes this as a messianic prophecy. When in Judaism at the time, when people were talking about, a future Messiah, nobody was talking about Micah chapter 5, verse 2. It's just that Micah 5:2 is saying that David's descendant, who comes out of Bethlehem, will be the ruler. And so, but Matthew wants to show that Jesus really fulfilled prophecy. And so Micah mentions Bethlehem, so he has to be born in Bethlehem, but everybody knew he didn't come from Bethlehem. He came from Nazareth. So how'd that happen? Well, it's because they were driven out by persecution for Matthew. And in Luke, it's because they actually started out in Nazareth, but they had the census they had to register for. So they do it in contradictory ways, but they both make the same point that Jesus is the one predicted by Scripture.
So, how about after Jesus was born? In Luke, they go to Nazareth, while in Matthew, they stay in Bethlehem for a while and then escape to Egypt after the wise men warn them. Why is there any theory about why Matthew doesn't have them just, go to Nazareth? Why is this slaughter
Yeah.
of innocents have to happen?
Yeah. Well, the whole thing is difficult for anybody trying to figure out what actually happened, if any of this happened like this. I mean, it's hard to reconcile these two accounts. Matthew, once again, he has them. Herod is going to kill the babies. Joseph is born, so he takes his family down to Egypt. And Matthew says it's to fulfill the scriptures. And he quotes Hosea chapter 11, verse 1, that out of Egypt I have called my son. And for Matthew, that means the Son of God now has come up out of Egypt. But Hosea is not talking about a Messiah. Hosea, when you just read Hosea in its context, it's quite clear. He's talking about the Exodus event when Moses led the people of Israel, the Son of God, out of Egypt. That's what Hosea is talking about. Matthew, though, wants another fulfillment of prophecy, and so he has Jesus go down to Egypt. I think that this is one of the things in these two accounts that simply cannot be reconciled. Because Luke is quite explicit that 8 days afterwards, Jesus is circumcised in Jerusalem. 32 days later, Mary does this little sacrifice in the temple, and Jesus is recognized there in the temple as the Son of God by two figures there, and then they immediately go back to Nazareth. If it's true they immediately went back to Nazareth, how is it that they went down to Egypt and spent months or years there? I mean, Matthew has them in Egypt then. Luke has them up in Nazareth then. I don't think that one can be reconciled.
How about the shepherds and the wise men? Those are quite substantial differences. You've got people working out on the hills, and then you've got like educated people coming from abroad to follow a star. Where did those two differences come from?
Yeah, well, those are differences, and I would say in that case they're not contradictions. They're differences, and because you can easily reconcile just by saying they both happened. The magi, the wise men, appear to have been following the star for a long time. Because they make inquiries in Jerusalem, where's the King of the Jews to be born? The stars led them to Jerusalem. And then Herod finds out they're inquiring, and he asks his scripture scholars, and they say, oh, he's to be born in Bethlehem. And so they go to Bethlehem, and they worship him there. And Herod, when he finds out, orders that all the boys 2 years and under are to be murdered. And he sends his troops to slaughter them. So, but it says that he based that judgment 2 years and under on when the Magi first said they started following the star. And so it's been a couple of years apparently, and they're still there. So in Matthew, it's these wise men who come to worship Jesus with nothing about the shepherds. But in Luke, it's the shepherds who come right when he's born, right after he's born. He's just been born, and they come and worship him. So you could reconcile those two, that first the shepherds came, then the Magi came later. But actually, part of the whole issue with this and with so many other things we talk about is that this isn't just about how can you reconcile the things, because each author is trying to make a point here. There's a reason that Matthew wants the wise men, and there's a reason that Luke wants the shepherds. The wise men are because these are not Jews. These are pagan astronomers from some other country who have been paying attention to what's happening up in the heavens and realizes that a King of the Jews has been born, and they come to worship him. They find out where he is from the Jewish scholars in Jerusalem who are scripture scholars. And Matthew's point actually is pretty subtle but startling, which is that the people who knew where Jesus was to be born, where the Son of God was to be born, the scholars in Jerusalem did not go to worship him. The Jewish scholars didn't go. These pagans who found out about it went. And this is kind of Matthew's message, is that Jews are going to reject Jesus, but Gentiles are going to accept him. And so in Matthew's gospel, Jesus ministers to Jews throughout his entire ministry and refuses to minister to anybody else, but they end up rejecting him at the end. And so Jesus sends his disciples out to all the nations. So that's embodied there just in this little magi story. Luke, on the other hand, one of Luke's main emphases in his gospel is that Jesus' message was meant for those who were poor and hungry and outcast and lowly and marginal. That's a big emphasis of Luke. And so who comes to worship Jesus? These shepherds. These shepherds would have been considered very lower class, probably hungry most of the time, living outdoors. There's no status or anything like that. They're the ones who come and worship Jesus. And so he's emphasizing Jesus' message coming to those who are most needy. And so they've got two different messages. And when people are just so concerned about reconciling the two, they miss the message for both of them. Yeah.
So do you see people trying to reconcile these regularly then?
Oh God, all the time. So I'm having this face to face with Jimmy, whom I've debated before, and as you said, these are supposed to be cordial conversations. I'm not sure I'm capable of that for some reason. I don't know. And so, but we're gonna, he thinks the whole thing is absolutely consistently, you put the two together and you get a consistent story, and I think you don't. But people are concerned to have a consistent story, because if you don't have a consistent story, if you have contradictions, then in this kind of opinion, one of them can't be true. And it's certainly right, they can't be historical. And since people value history so much, if they're not historical, they say, well, they can't be true then. And so, and I get that, but I think they're definitely can't be historical because they contradict each other.
If there's no way to reconcile them, what do we do with them when we're trying to explore what the historical circumstances might have been? Do you think we can use either story in any way, or is it best just to say Jesus was likely born in Nazareth and that's as far as we can go?
Well, we don't know. These are our only two records of Jesus' death. They're both Jesus' birth. They're both written about 85 years after it happened by people who didn't live in Israel, who didn't speak Aramaic, who have heard stories, and who are trying to explain how Jesus came, as everyone knows, came from Nazareth, but he really was the predicted Messiah to be born in Bethlehem, born of a virgin. And so they're getting these ideas to be born in Bethlehem, be born from a virgin from Scripture. They're trying to see that, that they take passages such as being born of a virgin in Isaiah and Bethlehem from Micah. They take these passages that were never interpreted as referring to messiahs, but they think, well, this shows that Jesus was the Messiah because he fulfilled these passages. And so, so they're doing that, and by doing that, they're clouding what actually happened. But they probably don't know what happened. The only way to know what happened is some very basics. It looks pretty clear that Jesus had two parents named Joseph and Mary. I think that's probably right. I don't know why Christians would make up Joseph and Mary in particular. Some people have theories, but I don't think so. I think he probably had two parents. They were from Nazareth. They were lower class people, as everybody in Nazareth was, probably leading a hand-to-mouth existence. And Jesus, that's where Jesus came from. I assume he's probably born there. This isn't just, by the way, this isn't just kind of an atheist liberal thing to say. I mean, the biblical scholars are really pretty widely in agreement. I think pretty widely in agreement on this. And even very, two of the top scholars of the historical Jesus at the end of the 20th century were John Meyer and Raymond Brown, who are both ordained Catholic priests who are very active in the Catholic Church. And they both said, yeah, it's more likely Nazareth. And so you can know that much. And the other things you would know were based on what we know about the kind of the socio-political situation in Nazareth and the economy of Nazareth and poverty in Nazareth. And when you know all those things, you get some basic idea, but you don't know the details.
So are there other historical problems with these gospel accounts aside from them just being completely contradictory?
Well, yeah, Matthew's account is pretty interesting because these wise men are following a star, apparently for a couple of years, and the thing is, you can't follow a star in a straight line because because of the rotation of the Earth and the way the revolving around the sun. And if you actually follow a star, you're just going to be going in kind of loop or in circles for. I mean, it's going to be really complicated to get someplace. So and the star in Matthew, the star leads them, but it stops over Jerusalem. How does a star stop over a city? And then they find out where he's to be born, and the star reappears. It takes them to Bethlehem, and the star stops over the house that Jesus is in. How does that work exactly? So I tell my students, go out sometime at night, a starry night, and look up and pick a star and say which house it's over. What? And so you have to end up with something other than a star, like some kind of bright light. And people have things, they talk about, oh, it's a comet, or it's it's a nova or something, whatever, supernova. But like none of it works unless it's like, 20 feet off the ground and stopping over the particular house. So there's that with Matthew. Luke has a different set of problems that are really historical in nature. Luke says that the reason Joseph and Mary had to go to Bethlehem was because Joseph was from the lineage of David, and there's this worldwide census. Under Caesar Augustus, there was a census that the entire world had to register for. Well, it obviously can't mean the entire world. I mean, they're not doing this in China because, Caesar Augustus is just the ruler of the Roman Empire. But so everybody in the Roman Empire is going to register for the census. But the reason that Joseph has to go to Bethlehem is because his ancestor David was from there. David lived 1,000 years earlier. So, does this mean everybody in the Roman Empire is going to their ancestral home from 1,000 years earlier? What? How's that
It
possible? For
sounds
one
more
thing,
chaotic than Thanksgiving traffic.
oh, it's far worse than as bad as it was. I was caught in it. As bad as it is, it is nothing like this. And I mean, for one thing, how do you know where to go? I mean, if there's suppose the Democrats get back in and they decide to tax us some more, and the new taxes, you got to return to where your ancestors came from 1,000 years ago to register for this tax, right? Where are you going to go? I have no idea. Like nobody would have any idea. And the entire Roman Empire is doing that, apparently, and there's no mention of it in any source. Like it didn't make the newspapers. It's like the chaos is just beyond belief. So that's a historical problem. It's a problem because Luke says that this census happened when Quirinius was the governor of Syria. Well, that's okay, except for Quirinius wasn't the governor of Syria until 10 years after the death of King Herod. And so it can't be. And so the whole thing is historically really problematic. So I think both on the grounds of the differences among them, the contradictions between them, and these historical complete implausibilities, that's why scholars think that these are stories being told. They're trying to convey some truths, but they're not, they couldn't have happened like this.
So they're not historically accurate accounts, but they are trying to convey truths. Does that put them in your category of myth?
Yeah, I suppose so, because Mary's a virgin, and so it's not she. Yes, that it involves a supernatural event. So it's a supernatural event that is fictional in that it didn't actually happen in history, but both accounts, as I've indicated, are trying very hard to make important points about Jesus, that he really is the Messiah, that he really did, he fulfilled prophecy, and that the stories themselves foreshadow what's going to happen in both Gospels. They're setting up how Jesus' life is going to transpire, and how, like in Matthew, how he's going to be rejected by Jews, and how in Luke, how he's going to be ministering to the outcasts. And so they have important points to make. And those points are important whether they're fiction or historically accurate accounts. And so I don't think they are historically accurate accounts, but I don't throw them out. I don't throw things out just because they didn't happen the way they're described.
Thank you very much, Bart. We are going to wrap up our interview for today, and we will be right back with some listeners' questions. All right, we have a selection of listeners' questions for you today, Bart. First up is looking at Jesus and the Samaritans and the Jews. Bart said previously that the focus on Jesus' ministry was to preach to the Jews. You actually said that again today. While Paul went beyond this and focused on the Gentiles. But what about Jesus' interactions with the Samaritans? How do they fit into this picture?
Well, we don't really know. I mean, there are accounts of Jesus involved with Samaritans. Samaria was the region that was between where Jesus grew up and lived in Galilee, up in the northern part of what we think of as Israel, and Judea, which was in the southern part, where Jerusalem was. The Samaria was the tract of land in between the two. And so to get to Judea from Galilee, the shortest route is to go through Samaria. There are mixed accounts of Jesus' involvement with Samaritans. Some positive, as in John chapter 4, where he has a conversation with a Samaritan woman for an entire chapter, and others like in the Gospel of Luke, where the Samaritans, right prior to Jesus telling this parable of the Good Samaritan, he tries to pass through Samaria, and the villages there won't even let him spend the night because they're enemies. And so I think historically we don't really have good purchase on whether Jesus had much involvement with Samaritans or not. We have these stories, but it's hard to validate that any of these happened. The story of the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, I don't think there's much of anything to kind of support that something has actually happened.
Thank you very much. In the extremely historically accurate Da Vinci Code, the Catholic Church works hard to hide the truth, about Jesus' relationship with Mary Magdalene. Whereas this is just poor fiction, the Church does do a lot of work denying the existence of Jesus' brothers. Why is the Catholic Church threatened by the idea that Jesus may have had siblings?
It's interesting, when I taught at Rutgers, this was the one issue my students got upset about. My students tended to be Roman Catholic instead of here in the South where they're evangelical Protestants. And the evangelical Protestants don't like it when I point out contradictions and things. And at Rutgers, they had no problem with that. They, they were kind of that Roman Catholic tradition where the Bible wasn't really kind of the main thing. But they got really upset when I said Jesus had brothers. And so, well, why is that? It's because as it happens in the tradition of Jesus' birth, in the New Testament, we have Mary conceiving as a virgin, but then Jesus has brothers and sisters. They're mentioned in Mark chapter 6. His brothers are mentioned in John chapter 7. The Apostle Paul mentions Jesus' brothers. One of them is named James. So there are brothers in the New Testament. But as time went on, people started talking about the holiness of Mary. And holiness in some circles was connected with being so devoted to God that you didn't engage in earthly activities that brought pleasure, like drinking a lot of wine or having sex. And so the idea developed that Mary never did have sex because she was a saint and she was devoted completely to God. But that means the perpetual virginity of Mary means that she never did have other children. Well, what do you do with the fact that you have these brothers and sisters in the New Testament? The first solution to that was found in the book I mentioned earlier, the Proto-Gospel of James, where it is indicated that these brothers of Jesus are actually the sons of Joseph from a previous marriage. That Joseph is an old man and that Mary's a young woman, and that since he's an old man, he's not interested in sex with her. And so that's why they give her over to, that's why she is protected by Joseph, because they're never going to have sex. But the brothers then are stepbrothers from Joseph. After a while, that view didn't succeed in early Christianity by the time of Jerome in the early 5th century, because Jerome insisted that Joseph was also a saint, which meant he also never had sex. And so that's when the Catholic Church started saying that they were his cousins. They weren't his brothers. And so it's in order to protect the purity and virginity of Mary.
Thank you. You've previously talked about instances of Paul quoting Jesus in his letters. Do scholars have an idea of what sources Paul might have used as reference for these quotations?
Well, different scholars will have different opinions. There are, different scholars have different opinions. But I think the most widespread opinion is that these are just traditions that Paul had heard. Paul did meet with Peter and James in Jerusalem at one point. 3 years after Paul converted, he met with Peter and spent some time with them, and saw James a little bit. 14 years later, he saw them some more. And the idea is that some of these things are just things that people were saying that Jesus had said. And so he may have heard them from the other apostles, or he may have just heard them as he's out and about. He's visiting. He's not only establishing his own churches, but we know that he's also in churches that were established by someone else. He spends time in Antioch, for example. And these Christian churches, of course, they're telling stories about Jesus. I mean, that's they're worshiping Jesus. They're going to tell stories about Jesus. So he probably heard them from those oral traditions.
Finally, is the Last Supper thought to be an historical event? And what resources can you suggest for someone who wants to find out more?
Well, so, I mean, clearly Jesus did have a last meal, and he probably had it with his disciples. It would have been the night before he was crucified. And so that much, I think, has got to be historical. I think, yeah, he had a meal of some kind. But usually when somebody asks that question, they're asking, whether the accounts recorded in the Gospels are things that actually happened. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the last meal is a Passover meal. The disciples asked Jesus, "Where do you want us to prepare the Passover for you?" And they make the meal ready. And then that night, it'd be a Friday evening. They would eat the Passover meal. And at that meal, Jesus takes the bread and he breaks it and says, "This is my body." He takes the cup. He says, "This is the new covenant in my blood." And he gives it to them. He's indicating he's going to die for the sake of others. John does not have it as a Passover meal. John has Jesus die the day before the Passover meal is eaten, on a different day. He does have a last meal in John with the disciples. And in that case, instead of instituting the Lord's Supper with the bread and the cup, he washes the disciples' feet. And that's the important symbolic event in John. The accounts are at odds with each other in a number of ways. Even Matthew, Mark, and Luke have differences among them. I don't think that the last meal I don't think Jesus was saying he was dying for the sins of the world. He may have realized that his time was up. He may have predicted that he's going to be arrested. I don't know. I don't think we know. So I think it's one of these things where you've got the basic outlines got to be pretty right, that his last meal was in Jerusalem with his disciples the day before he got killed. But what actually happened at the meal, I don't think we have the sources of information that can really tell us accurately.
Audience, thank you all for your questions. Bart, thank you very much for answering them for us. Now, before we finish for the week, would you mind just reminding us what we spoke about today?
Well, we're talking about whether the events described around Jesus' birth in Matthew and Luke, the only two Gospels that discuss it, whether these accounts can be reconciled with each other, whether there are things in them that almost certainly could not have happened, and if so, what the meaning is, and does it matter? Are these myths not in the negative sense that, oh yeah, they didn't really happen, or are they myths in the sense that they're actually trying to convey truths by telling stories about Jesus? And I think the latter, and I think it's a mistake to try and reconcile the two.
Audience, thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you did, please subscribe to the podcast to make sure you don't miss future episodes. Remember that you can use the code MJPodcast for a discount on all of Bart's courses over at www.barterman.com. That includes Dr. Jodi Magness's new course and also the face-to-face discussions. Thank you all so much. If you are celebrating Hanukkah next week, have a wonderful time and goodbye. This has been an episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart Ehrman. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please be sure to subscribe to our show for free on your favourite podcast listening app or on Bart Ehrman's YouTube channel so you don't miss out. From Bart Ehrman and myself, Megan Lewis, thank you for joining us.